The morning started like any other at Windsor Castle. Servants moved quietly through the grand corridors, polishing silver and arranging fresh flowers in crystal vases. The smell of breakfast drifted from the kitchen, mixing with the scent of old wood and expensive perfume that seemed to live in the walls. Nobody knew that before the day ended, everything would change. A scandal was brewing that would shake the very foundation of the royal household. And it would all start with a simple phone call. Captain Richard Hartley stood in his office at the Royal Guard headquarters, staring at his phone. The message he had just received made his blood run cold. It was from an anonymous source, someone claiming to have information about stolen royal property. At first, Richard thought it might be a prank. People often tried to get attention by making false claims about the royal family, but something about this message felt different. It was too detailed, too specific. The sender mentioned items that only a handful of people knew existed. Richard had served the royal family for 20 years. He knew every corner of every palace, every rule, every tradition. He had seen scandals come and go, but he had never seen anything quite like this. The message mentioned specific pieces from the late Queen's personal jewelry collection. These were not the crown jewels that tourists came to see. These were private items, gifts from world leaders, family heirlooms passed down through generations. Each piece had a story, a history, a meaning. And according to the message, several of these priceless items were missing. He called his deputy, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, into his office. Sarah was sharp, careful, and discreet. If anyone could help him figure out if this was real or fake, it was her. He showed her the message on his phone, watching her face change as she read it. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened slightly, and she looked up at him with concern written all over her face. She had the same thought he did. This could not be ignored. They spent the next 2 hours making quiet inquiries. They could not just march into the royal vaults and start counting jewels. Everything had to be done carefully, properly through the right channels. Richard made phone calls to the master of the household, to the keeper of the privy purse, to people who kept records of every royal possession. Each conversation was delicate, each question carefully worded. He did not want to start rumors or cause panic. But with each call, the picture became clearer and more troubling. By noon, they had confirmation. 3 pieces were indeed missing from the late Queen's collection. A diamond brooch given by the Sultan of Brunei in 1972, a sapphire necklace that had belonged to Queen Victoria, and a ruby bracelet that had been a gift from the President of France. Together, these items were worth millions of pounds, but their historical value was beyond measure. They were part of British history, part of the royal legacy, and now they were gone. Richard felt sick. In all his years of service, nothing like this had ever happened on his watch. The security systems were supposed to be perfect. Every item was catalogued, every vault was monitored, every person who entered was logged and tracked. How could 3 major pieces simply disappear? And more importantly, who had taken them? The anonymous message had not just told him about the missing jewels. It had also told him where to look. And that was the part that made this whole situation even more unbelievable. The message claimed that the jewels were at Raymill House, the private country estate of Camilla, the queen consort. Richard read that line over and over again, hoping he had misunderstood. But there was no other way to interpret it. Someone was claiming that Camilla had the missing jewels. It seemed impossible, ridiculous even. Why would she need to steal anything? She was married to the king. She had access to more jewels than most people could imagine. The entire situation made no sense, but Richard knew he had to follow protocol. If the information was wrong, they would investigate quietly and prove it false. If it was right, well, then they had a much bigger problem. Either way, he could not ignore a credible tip about stolen royal property. He would have to go to Raymill House. He would have to search the premises. And if Camilla was there, he would have to face her directly. The thought made him nervous. She was not someone who enjoyed being questioned or challenged. Richard assembled a small team. He picked people he trusted completely, people who could be discreet. Lieutenant Mitchell would come with him, along with 2 other senior officers. They would travel in unmarked cars. They would not wear full uniforms. They needed to do this quietly, without attracting attention from the media or the public. If word got out that the Royal Guard was searching Camilla's private home, the scandal would explode before they even knew if anything was wrong. As they drove through the countryside toward Raymill House, Richard went over the plan in his head. They would arrive, present their credentials, explain the situation calmly and professionally. They would ask for permission to search the premises. If Camilla refused, things would get complicated quickly. They would need a warrant, which would require involving judges and lawyers and potentially the king himself. Richard hoped it would not come to that. He hoped she would cooperate. He hoped this whole thing was just a terrible misunderstanding. The estate appeared in the distance, sitting on a gentle hill surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens. It was beautiful, peaceful, the kind of place where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. As they drove up the long gravel driveway, Richard noticed several cars parked near the main entrance. Camilla was home. His heart began to beat faster. In a few minutes, he would be standing face to face with the queen consort, accusing her of theft. Even if he did it politely, even if he followed every rule, this was going to be one of the most difficult moments of his career. They parked and walked to the front door. Richard straightened his jacket, took a deep breath, and rang the bell. A butler answered, looking surprised to see them. Richard showed his identification and asked to speak with Camilla. The butler hesitated, clearly unsure what to do. After a moment, he nodded and asked them to wait in the entrance hall. As they stood there, surrounded by expensive furniture and paintings, Richard wondered what would happen next. Would Camilla be shocked, angry, defensive, or would she know exactly why they were here? Within moments, he would find out. The truth was waiting just beyond the next door. Camilla appeared in the doorway wearing a simple cream dress and pearl earrings. She looked calm, almost too calm for someone who had just been told the royal guard wanted to speak with her. Richard noticed her hands were steady as she gestured for them to come into the drawing room. She did not ask why they were there. She did not seem surprised or confused. Instead, she simply smiled politely and offered them tea. Something about her reaction made Richard even more uneasy. Most people would be demanding explanations by now. Richard declined the tea and explained the situation as professionally as he could. He told her about the missing jewels from the late Queen's collection. He told her they had received information suggesting the items might be on this property. He was careful with his words, never directly accusing her, always leaving room for a reasonable explanation. As he spoke, Camilla's expression did not change. She sat in her chair, legs crossed, hands folded in her lap, listening patiently as if he were describing the weather. When he finished, there was a long silence. Camilla looked at each of the officers in turn, her eyes sharp and calculating. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was steady, controlled, almost amused. She told them this was clearly a mistake, obviously someone trying to cause trouble for her. She said she had no idea where those jewels were, and she certainly did not have them in her home. She suggested they were wasting their time and should be out looking for the real thief, instead of bothering her with ridiculous accusations. Richard had expected this response. He explained that they needed to search the property to eliminate it as a possibility. He said it was standard procedure, nothing personal, just following protocol. Camilla's smile faded slightly. She asked if they had a warrant. Richard admitted they did not, but explained that cooperation would make everything easier for everyone involved. The alternative would be to go through official channels, which would take time and would likely attract media attention. He hoped the implication was clear. Better to handle this quietly now than to make it a public spectacle later. Camilla stood up and walked to the window, looking out at her gardens. She was quiet for what felt like forever. Richard watched her back, trying to read her body language. Was she considering her options? Was she trying to figure out how to refuse without looking guilty? Finally, she turned around and agreed to the search. But there was a condition. She wanted to be present in every room they searched. She wanted to watch them, to make sure they did not plant evidence or damage her property. Richard agreed immediately. Having her there would actually be better. If they found nothing, she could confirm it. And if they found something, she could not later claim they had put it there. They started in the ground floor rooms. The drawing room where they were standing, the dining room, the library, the conservatory. Everything was exactly as you would expect in a country estate. Expensive furniture, valuable paintings, shelves full of books and decorative objects. But nothing that looked like stolen royal jewels. Richard's team was thorough, checking drawers, looking behind paintings, examining every corner. Camilla followed them from room to room, her arms crossed, her expression growing more irritated with each passing minute. She made comments under her breath about invasion of privacy and abuse of power. After an hour, they moved upstairs. The bedrooms were more personal, more private. Richard felt increasingly uncomfortable as they searched through closets and dresser drawers. This felt wrong, invasive, like something that should not be happening. But he kept going because he had a job to do. They checked the guest rooms first, finding nothing unusual. Then they approached the master bedroom. Camilla hesitated at the doorway. For the first time since they arrived, she looked genuinely nervous. She said something about the room being messy, about not having expected visitors. But Richard noticed her hand was shaking slightly as she reached for the door handle. The master bedroom was large and elegant, decorated in soft blues and creams. A four-poster bed dominated the space, covered in silk pillows. French doors led to a private balcony. Everything looked normal, perfect even. But Lieutenant Mitchell noticed something. She walked over to an antique dresser against the far wall and pointed to the top drawer. It was slightly open, just a crack, as if someone had closed it in a hurry. She looked at Richard, then at Camilla. She asked if she could open it. Camilla said yes, but her voice had lost its confident edge. She sounded smaller somehow, quieter. Sarah pulled the drawer open slowly. Inside were the usual things you would find in a bedroom dresser. Scarves, gloves, small accessories. But underneath a pile of silk scarves, something sparkled. Sarah moved the scarves aside carefully, and there it was. The diamond brooch from the Sultan of Brunei. Even in the soft bedroom light, it shone with an intensity that took everyone's breath away. The diamonds were arranged in the shape of a peacock, each stone perfectly cut, each color carefully chosen. It was unmistakably one of the missing pieces. There was no way to claim it was a replica or a similar item. This was the real thing. Richard looked at Camilla. Her face had gone pale. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. Sarah reached deeper into the drawer, moving aside more scarves and handkerchiefs. She pulled out a velvet jewelry box. Inside was the sapphire necklace that had belonged to Queen Victoria. The stones were a deep royal blue, set in gold so old it had a warm, rich patina. Next to it, wrapped in tissue paper, was the ruby bracelet from France. All three missing pieces hidden in Camilla's bedroom dresser, under her personal belongings. The evidence was overwhelming. There could be no innocent explanation for this. The room fell silent. Richard could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of what they had just discovered. This was not just theft. This was betrayal at the highest level. These were pieces that had belonged to the late queen, pieces that should have been secured in the royal vaults, pieces that represented centuries of history and tradition. And they were hidden in a drawer like common costume jewelry. He looked at Camilla again, waiting for her to say something, to offer some kind of explanation. But she just stood there staring at the jewels, her face blank. Finally she spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She said it was not what it looked like. She said she could explain. But before she could continue, Richard held up his hand. He told her that anything she said would be recorded and could be used in an investigation. He advised her to wait until she had legal representation before making any statements. He was following procedure, protecting both her rights and the integrity of the case. But inside, his mind was racing. How had this happened? Why had she done it? And most importantly, what would happen to the royal family when this news became public? Sarah carefully photographed the jewels exactly as they had found them. She documented the dresser, the drawer, the way the items were hidden under the scarves. Every detail would be important later. Richard called headquarters and reported what they had found. Within minutes, more officers were on their way to secure the scene and transport the evidence. Camilla sat down on the edge of her bed, her perfect composure finally crumbling. She put her head in her hands. The woman who had walked into the drawing room an hour ago, confident and unbothered, was gone. In her place was someone who looked defeated, trapped, and very afraid of what would come next. Within 2 hours, Raymill House was surrounded by police vehicles and security personnel. The quiet country estate had transformed into a crime scene. Officers cordoned off areas with yellow tape. Forensic teams arrived to process the evidence. A media helicopter circled overhead, having picked up on police radio chatter about something big happening at the Queen Consort's private residence. Richard knew it would only be a matter of hours before this story exploded across every news channel in the world. The scandal he had hoped to avoid was now inevitable. Camilla was taken to a private room in the estate, guarded by 2 officers. She was not under arrest yet, But she was not free to leave either. Richard had to notify the king immediately. This was not a conversation he wanted to have, but there was no way around it. He stepped outside into the garden away from the chaos and made the call. The king's private secretary answered. Richard explained the situation as clearly and briefly as possible. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a string of questions. Where were the jewels found? Was Camilla being charged? Had the media been informed? Richard answered each question carefully, knowing every word would be analyzed and remembered. The king arrived at Raymill House just before sunset. His car pulled up the driveway at high speed, followed by several security vehicles. He stepped out looking furious and worried at the same time. Richard met him at the entrance and briefed him on everything that had happened. The king listened without interrupting, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists. When Richard finished, the king asked to see the evidence. They walked upstairs to the master bedroom where the jewels had been, carefully photographed and catalogued, but left in place until the king could see them with his own eyes. The king stared at the open dresser drawer for a long time without saying anything. Richard watched him struggle to process what he was seeing. These were his mother's jewels. These were pieces he had grown up seeing her wear on special occasions. And now they were here, hidden in his wife's bedroom under scarves and handkerchiefs like stolen goods. The betrayal must have felt enormous. Finally, the king spoke. His voice was tight with emotion. He wanted to know why. Why would Camilla do this? What could she possibly have been thinking? Richard had no answers. Nobody did. Only Camilla knew the truth, and she had not said anything useful yet. The king demanded to speak with Camilla alone. Richard advised against it, explaining that anything discussed could complicate the investigation. But the king was insistent. This was his wife, his family, his private matter. Richard reluctantly agreed, but insisted that a lawyer be present. The king accepted this compromise. They went downstairs to the room where Camilla was waiting. She stood up when they entered, her eyes red from crying. She started to speak, but the king held up his hand. He told her that a lawyer was coming, and until then she should say nothing. His tone was cold, formal, nothing like how a husband should speak to his wife. Camilla nodded and sat back down, looking smaller and more vulnerable than Richard had ever seen her. While they waited for the lawyer, Richard received a call from the palace press office. The media had the story. Somehow, despite all their efforts to keep this quiet, journalists had found out about the search, the discovery, everything. News vans were already setting up outside the estate gates. Headlines were being written. Social media was exploding with speculation and theories. The press officer wanted to know what official statement they should release. Richard told him to say as little as possible for now. Confirmed that an investigation was underway regarding missing royal property. Do not mention Camilla by name yet. Do not discuss details. But even as he said this, he knew it was too late. The story was out there and it was only going to get bigger. The lawyer arrived 30 minutes later. She was a senior partner at one of London's most prestigious law firms, someone who had handled royal matters before. She went into the room with Camilla and the king, closing the door behind her. Richard and his team waited outside, listening to the muffled voices through the thick walls. The conversation went on for over an hour. When the door finally opened, the lawyer emerged looking grim. She asked to speak with Richard privately. They walked to another room and she explained the situation. Camilla wanted to cooperate. She wanted to tell her side of the story. But the lawyer needed assurances about how the information would be used. Richard explained that he could not make any promises about charges or prosecution. That decision would be made by others, people far above his pay grade. But he could promise that anything Camilla said would be recorded accurately and fairly. The lawyer considered this, then nodded. She said Camilla was ready to make a statement. They returned to the room where Camilla and the king were waiting. The king looked exhausted, his face drawn and pale. Camilla looked resigned, like someone who had accepted her fate and just wanted to get it over with. Lieutenant Mitchell set up a recording device. Richard read Camilla her rights, making sure she understood that anything she said could be used in court. Then he asked her to explain how the jewels ended up in her dresser. Camilla took a deep breath and began to speak. Her voice was shaky at first, but grew steadier as she went on. She said it started 6 months ago, shortly after the late Queen's death. The royal household was organizing the Queen's personal belongings, sorting through decades of accumulated possessions. Camilla had been asked to help with the jewelry, to catalog pieces and decide which should go to the royal collection and which were more personal family items. During this process, she had access to many pieces that had never been photographed or properly documented. Some of them were incredible, more beautiful than anything Camilla had ever owned herself. She admitted that she became obsessed with 3 pieces in particular: the diamond brooch, the sapphire necklace, and the ruby bracelet. She would find excuses to look at them, to hold them, to imagine wearing them. She told herself she was just admiring them, that there was nothing wrong with appreciating beautiful things. But the truth was darker than that. She wanted them, not just to look at or borrow, but to own, to possess, to have for herself. The desire grew stronger every day until it became impossible to ignore. She knew it was wrong. She knew it was theft, but she convinced herself that she deserved them, that she had earned them through years of service to the royal family. One day, when she was alone in the vault, she made her decision. She took the 3 pieces and hid them in her handbag. She walked out of the palace with stolen royal jewels, her heart pounding, expecting someone to stop her at any moment. But nobody did. The security systems were focused on preventing people from breaking in, not on catching people walking out with authorization. She brought the jewels to Raymil House and hid them in her dresser. She told herself she would return them eventually, that she was just borrowing them for a while. But days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, and she never took them back. She would take them out sometimes when she was alone, just to look at them, to feel their weight in her hands. She claimed she never wore them, never showed them to anyone. They were her secret, her private treasure. She knew if anyone found out it would be a disaster, but she also could not bring herself to return them. And now, sitting in this room with her husband, the royal guard, and her lawyer, she realized how foolish she had been. She had risked everything: her reputation, her position, her marriage, for 3 pieces of jewelry. She looked at the king and apologized. She said she knew sorry was not enough, that she had betrayed him and betrayed the memory of his mother. She said she did not expect forgiveness. She just wanted him to know the truth. The room was silent when she finished. The king sat with his head in his hands, processing everything he had just heard. Richard felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of him felt sorry for Camilla. She had made a terrible mistake, driven by jealousy and desire and perhaps loneliness. But another part of him was angry. She had abused her position, stolen irreplaceable historical items, and created a scandal that would damage the royal family for years to come. Whatever sympathy he felt was overshadowed by the magnitude of what she had done. The consequences would be severe, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop them now. By morning, the story was on the front page of every newspaper in Britain. The headlines were brutal. Some called it the greatest royal scandal in decades. Others compared Camilla to historical figures who had fallen from grace. Television news programs showed aerial footage of Raymil House, interviewed royal experts, and speculated endlessly about what would happen next. The public reaction was fierce. Some people expressed sympathy for Camilla, suggesting she might have been under stress or dealing with grief, but most were outraged. How could someone in her position with so much privilege and wealth steal from the crown? The palace was in crisis mode. Emergency meetings were held throughout the night. The king's advisors debated how to handle the situation. Some argued that Camilla should be prosecuted like any other thief, that nobody was above the law, not even the queen consort. Others worried about the damage this would do to the monarchy's reputation. If they charged her, it would confirm that the royal family could not even trust each other. If they did not charge her, it would look like they were protecting criminals. There was no good option, no way to make this go away cleanly. Every choice had terrible consequences. Richard spent the night at Windsor Castle, giving statements to senior officials and helping coordinate the investigation. The stolen jewels had been transported back to the royal vaults under heavy security. Experts examined them to confirm they had not been damaged or altered. Thankfully, all 3 pieces were in perfect condition, but the real damage was not to the jewels. It was to relationships, to trust, to the institution of the monarchy itself. Richard wondered if things would ever be the same again. The late queen had spent her entire life building respect for the royal family. Camilla had damaged that legacy in a single reckless act. The king requested a private meeting with Richard early that morning. They met in a small office away from the main areas of the castle. The king looked like he had not slept. His eyes were bloodshot, his face gray with exhaustion. He thanked Richard for handling the situation professionally. Then he asked a question that Richard had been dreading. What would Richard recommend they do? Should they press charges? Should they try to handle this privately? The king was asking for advice that Richard was not qualified to give. This was a legal matter, a family matter, and a constitutional matter all rolled into one impossible situation. Richard chose his words carefully. He said that from a legal standpoint, theft had occurred. The evidence was clear, the confession was recorded, and any prosecutor would have an easy case. If Camilla were anyone else, she would definitely be charged. But she was not anyone else. She was the queen consort, married to the king, a public figure whose prosecution would have enormous political and social ramifications. Richard suggested that the king consult with the attorney general, with constitutional lawyers, and with his closest advisors. This decision was too big for one person to make alone. It would affect not just Camilla, not just the king, but the entire future of the monarchy. The king nodded slowly. He asked Richard one more question. Did Richard believe Camilla's explanation? Did he think she had really just been overcome by desire and made a terrible mistake? Or was there something more calculated about it? Richard thought for a moment before answering. He said that based on his years of experience, Camilla seemed genuinely remorseful. Her confession felt honest, not like someone trying to minimize their actions or shift blame. She had admitted everything, accepted full responsibility, and showed real shame about what she had done. That did not excuse the theft, but it did suggest she was not a hardened criminal. She was someone who had made a catastrophic error in judgment. The king seemed to find some small comfort in this assessment. He dismissed Richard and spent the rest of the day in meetings. By afternoon, an official statement was released. It confirmed that items from the late queen's collection had been recovered. It acknowledged that the queen consort had taken the items without authorization. It expressed the king's deep disappointment and sorrow over the situation. And it announced that Camilla was stepping back from all official royal duties indefinitely, while the matter was being resolved. The statement carefully avoided words like theft or crime, but everyone understood what had happened. Camilla had been caught, confessed, and was now facing consequences. Public opinion remained divided. Some people felt the statement was too soft, that Camilla was getting special treatment because of her position. They pointed out that ordinary citizens would be in jail already for the same crime. Others felt that public humiliation was punishment enough. Camilla's reputation was destroyed. Her position as queen consort was in serious doubt. Her marriage was under enormous strain. She had lost the respect of the nation and possibly her family. What more could they do to her? The debate raged on television, radio, and social media. Everyone had an opinion about what should happen next. Meanwhile, investigators were trying to figure out how Camilla had managed to take the jewels in the first place. They reviewed security footage, interviewed palace staff, and examined access logs. What they discovered was troubling. The security systems for the late queen's personal collection were not as robust as they should have been. Because these were private items rather than official crown jewels, they had been treated more casually. Camilla had legitimate access as part of the cataloging project. Nobody had thought to implement extra oversight or random checks. The system had relied on trust, and that trust had been betrayed. New procedures were immediately put in place to prevent anything like this from happening again. Richard received dozens of calls from journalists wanting interviews, wanting inside information, wanting to know every detail of the search and discovery. He refused them all. His job was to serve the crown, not to profit from its scandals. He kept his head down, continued with his regular duties, and tried to ignore the media circus surrounding him. But it was impossible to escape completely. Everywhere he went, people wanted to talk about Camilla and the jewels. His colleagues asked questions. His friends had opinions. Even strangers on the street recognized him from news footage and wanted to share their thoughts. The scandal had consumed everything. A week after the discovery, Richard received an unexpected visitor at his office. It was one of Camilla's close friends, a woman who had known her for decades. She asked if they could speak privately. Richard agreed, curious about what she wanted. The woman explained that Camilla was devastated, barely leaving her room, refusing to eat or speak to most people. She was facing the very real possibility of prosecution and divorce. Her entire world had collapsed. The woman wanted Richard to know that Camilla had always been kind, generous, and caring. This one terrible mistake did not define who she was as a person. She hoped Richard might speak on Camilla's behalf, might tell others about her remorse and cooperation. Richard listened politely, but explained that he could not advocate for or against Camilla. His role was to investigate and report facts, not to judge character or lobby for leniency. The woman seemed disappointed but not surprised. She thanked him for his time and left. After she was gone, Richard sat alone in his office thinking about everything that had happened. He felt sympathy for Camilla despite what she had done. She had thrown away everything for 3 pieces of jewelry. It was such a senseless, tragic waste, but he also felt sympathy for the king, who had to balance his duties as monarch with his feelings as a husband. And he felt sympathy for the late queen, whose precious belongings had been stolen by her own daughter-in-law. As the week came to an end, rumors began circulating about what the government would decide. Some sources said charges were inevitable, that the Attorney General had no choice but to prosecute. Others claimed a private arrangement was being negotiated, something that would punish Camilla without dragging the royal family through a criminal trial. Nobody knew for certain what would happen. The decision was being made behind closed doors by people at the highest levels of power. All Richard could do was wait, like everyone else in Britain, to see what consequences Camilla would ultimately face for her shocking betrayal of trust. 2 weeks after the jewels were discovered, the Attorney General made a formal announcement. After careful consideration of all the facts, including Camilla's full cooperation and genuine remorse, the decision had been made not to pursue criminal charges. However, this did not mean there would be no consequences. Camilla was required to make a substantial financial payment to a charity chosen by the royal family. She would undergo counseling to address the psychological issues that led to her actions, and she would be permanently removed from any role involving the management or access to royal property. The announcement tried to strike a balance between justice and pragmatism, but it satisfied almost nobody. Critics immediately attacked the decision as proof that the wealthy and powerful lived by different rules. They pointed to cases where ordinary people had received prison sentences for stealing far less valuable items. Legal experts debated whether the decision was legally sound or politically motivated. Some members of Parliament called for a full inquiry into how the decision was made. The controversy threatened to overshadow the original scandal. What had started as a story about theft was now becoming a story about inequality and justice. The government found itself defending a decision that had been meant to protect the monarchy, but instead exposed uncomfortable truths about privilege and accountability. Meanwhile, the king and Camilla's marriage was under intense strain. They were living in separate residences, speaking only through lawyers and intermediaries. Sources close to the couple said the king felt deeply betrayed, not just by the theft itself, but by the deception. Camilla had looked him in the eye every day for months, knowing she had stolen from his mother's collection. She had sat at family dinners, attended official functions, and pretended everything was normal. That level of dishonesty was hard to forgive. Some royal observers predicted divorce was inevitable. Others believed the king would eventually forgive his wife, prioritizing family unity over personal hurt. Only time would tell which prediction was correct. Richard continued his work at the Royal Guard, but the case had changed him. He had always believed in the fundamental goodness of the people he served. He had trusted that members of the royal family understood the responsibility and privilege of their positions. Camilla's actions had shaken that faith. If she could betray the crown, who else might do the same? He found himself questioning things he had always taken for granted. He implemented new security procedures, added layers of oversight, and became more suspicious of everyone. His colleagues noticed the change. Some worried he was becoming paranoid. Others understood that he was simply adapting to a new reality, where trust could no longer be assumed. The anonymous source who had tipped off Richard about the stolen jewels was never identified. Investigators tried to trace the message, but it had been sent through multiple encrypted servers, making it virtually impossible to track. Speculation ran wild about who might have known about the theft and decided to expose it. Some thought it was a palace insider, perhaps a staff member who had noticed something suspicious. Others believed it might have been someone close to Camilla who was concerned about her behavior. There were even conspiracy theories suggesting the king himself had arranged for the tip, wanting his wife caught but not wanting to directly betray her. The truth remained a mystery. Camilla remained in seclusion at a private residence away from the public eye. She released a written statement apologizing to the nation, to the king, and to the memory of the late queen. The statement was carefully worded by lawyers, but seemed to convey genuine regret. She acknowledged that she had betrayed the trust placed in her and had caused immeasurable damage to the institution she was supposed to serve. She accepted full responsibility for her actions and promised to spend the rest of her life trying to make amends. The statement was met with mixed reactions. Some people appreciated the apology, others felt it was too little, too late. Words could not undo what had been done. In the months that followed, life slowly began to return to something resembling normal. The media moved on to other stories. Public interest in the scandal gradually faded. The king resumed his official duties, appearing confident and composed in public, whatever turmoil he might have felt privately. Camilla remained out of sight, living quietly, reportedly spending her time reading, gardening, and attending therapy sessions. There were occasional sightings of her in small villages near her residence, always alone, always trying to avoid attention. The woman who had once walked red carpets and attended state dinners was now living like a ghost, present but invisible. Richard received a commendation for his handling of the case. His superiors praised his professionalism, discretion, and thorough investigation. But the award felt hollow to him. He had done his job, yes, but the outcome left him unsatisfied. Justice had been served in some ways, but not in others. The jewels had been recovered, the truth had been exposed, and consequences had been imposed. Yet something felt incomplete, unresolved. Perhaps it was because he had seen the human cost of the scandal up close. He had watched a woman destroy her life over material possessions. He had witnessed a marriage crumble under the weight of betrayal. He had observed an institution struggle to maintain dignity in the face of shameful revelations. One evening, several months after the incident, Richard visited the royal vaults where the recovered jewels were now stored. He stood in front of the secure case containing the diamond brooch, the sapphire necklace, and the ruby bracelet. They looked exactly as they had the day they were found in Camilla's dresser, beautiful and timeless and completely indifferent to the chaos they had caused. Richard thought about all the people who had been affected by these three objects. The late queen who had cherished them, Camilla who had coveted them, the king who had been betrayed over them, and countless others whose lives had been touched by the scandal in small or significant ways. He wondered what the late queen would have thought about all of this. Would she have been angry? Disappointed? Forgiving? She had been known for her sense of duty, her commitment to the monarchy's dignity, and her belief in second chances. Richard liked to think she would have handled the situation with grace and wisdom. She would have understood that people make mistakes, even terrible ones, but she would also have insisted on accountability and consequences. She had spent her entire life upholding standards, and she would not have wanted those standards compromised, not even for family. The jewels represented more than wealth or beauty. They represented history, responsibility, and the trust that came with royal privilege. As Richard left the vault that evening, he reflected on the lessons learned from this case. Power and privilege do not guarantee good character. Trust must be constantly earned and protected. And sometimes the most valuable things we possess are not material objects, but relationships, reputations, and integrity. Camilla had learned these lessons the hardest way possible, losing almost everything for a moment of weakness. The king had learned that even those closest to us can disappoint us profoundly. And Richard himself had learned that his job was not just about preventing crimes or catching criminals. It was about protecting an institution that represented something larger than any individual, something worth preserving despite human flaws and failures. The scandal would be remembered as one of the most shocking episodes in recent royal history. Books would be written about it, documentaries would analyze it, and historians would debate its significance for generations. But for those who lived through it, who experienced it firsthand, it was more than just a historical event. It was a reminder of how quickly things can fall apart, how easily trust can be broken, and how difficult it is to rebuild what has been destroyed. The jewels were safe now, locked away where they belonged, but the damage to relationships, to reputations, and to the monarchy's image would take much longer to repair, if it could be repaired at all. In the quiet moments of his own life, Richard sometimes thought about that day at Raymill House. He remembered the look on Camilla's face when they found the jewels, the devastation and resignation in her eyes. He remembered the king's fury and pain. He remembered the weight of history in his hands as he documented the evidence. These memories would stay with him forever, a permanent reminder that even in positions of privilege and power, people remain human, capable of both great nobility and terrible mistakes. The case was closed, the investigation complete, but its impact would echo through the royal family and British society for years to come. A year after the scandal, something unexpected happened. The king invited Camilla to a private meeting at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. They had not spoken face-to-face in months, communicating only through official channels and intermediaries. Royal watchers speculated about what this meeting might mean. Was reconciliation possible? Or was this a final conversation before divorce proceedings began? The media camped outside the castle gates, waiting for any sign of what was happening inside. But the walls of Balmoral kept their secrets well. Whatever passed between the king and his estranged wife remained private. According to sources who spoke anonymously afterward, the meeting lasted several hours. The king and Camilla talked about everything that had happened, about the theft, the lies, the betrayal, and the consequences. Camilla explained in detail what had driven her to such desperate actions. She spoke about feeling inadequate, about living in the shadow of the late queen, about the pressure of constantly being compared to someone she could never match. She admitted that stealing the jewels had been a twisted attempt to possess something of the queen's legacy, to have a tangible connection to the woman whose place she had taken. It was irrational, she knew, but emotions rarely followed logic. The king listened without interrupting. When Camilla finished, he shared his own feelings. He talked about the anger he had felt, the sense of betrayal that had consumed him for months. He explained how difficult it had been to reconcile the woman he loved with the person who had stolen from his mother's collection. But he also acknowledged his own failures. He admitted that he had been so focused on his duties as king that he had neglected his duties as a husband. He had not noticed the signs of Camilla's distress. He had not created a safe space for her to share her struggles. While this did not excuse what she had done, it did provide context. They had both failed each other in different ways. At the end of their conversation, they reached an understanding. The king was willing to work toward forgiveness, but it would take time. Trust once broken so completely could not be instantly restored. Camilla accepted this. She understood that she would need to prove herself through years of changed behavior, not just through words or promises. They agreed to attend counseling together, to work on their marriage with professional help. They would not rush back into public life as if nothing had happened. Instead, they would rebuild slowly, privately, away from the cameras and judgment. It was a cautious first step toward healing, with no guarantee of success. The news of their meeting leaked to the press within days. Headlines proclaimed that reconciliation was underway, that the king had forgiven his wife, that the royal marriage would survive after all. But those close to the situation knew the truth was more complicated. Forgiveness was a process, not an event. The king had chosen to try, but that did not mean everything was fine. Camilla would need to earn back not just her husband's trust, but also the trust of the nation. She would need to demonstrate through consistent action that she had changed, that she understood the gravity of what she had done, and that she would never betray the crown again. Meanwhile, Richard had been promoted to a higher position within the royal guard. His handling of the Camilla case had proven his capabilities in crisis management. His new role involved overseeing all security operations for royal properties and family members. It was a significant responsibility, one that came with considerable pressure. But Richard felt ready for it. The scandal had taught him valuable lessons about human nature, about the complexities of power and privilege, and about the importance of vigilance. He implemented new protocols based on what he had learned, ensuring that no similar incident could occur in the future. The system would no longer rely solely on trust. It would be backed by checks, balances, and oversight. 2 years after the theft was discovered, Camilla made her first public appearance since the scandal. It was at a small charity event. Nothing glamorous or high profile. She arrived quietly without fanfare and spent the afternoon meeting with volunteers and beneficiaries. She listened to their stories, offered encouragement, and made modest donations. There were no photographers except for the official charity photographer. No journalists were invited. This was not about publicity or image rehabilitation. This was about genuine service, about using her position to help others rather than to benefit herself. The event organizers later reported that Camilla had been humble, kind, and sincere. She had not tried to draw attention to herself or seek praise for her participation. Over the following months, Camilla continued this pattern. She attended small events, worked with charities behind the scenes, and slowly began to rebuild her public image through consistent, quiet service. She never mentioned the scandal in public. She never tried to explain or justify what she had done. She simply worked, day after day, to prove that she had learned from her mistakes and was committed to being better. Public opinion began to soften slightly. Some people remained unforgiving, convinced that she had escaped justice and did not deserve a second chance. But others appreciated her humility and her efforts to make amends through action rather than words. The king and Camilla's relationship also gradually improved. They began appearing together occasionally at family events, always keeping a respectful distance but showing a united front. They attended therapy regularly, working through their issues with professional guidance. Friends reported that they were learning to communicate better, to share their feelings more openly, and to support each other through difficulties. The marriage would never be the same as it had been before the scandal. Too much had happened, too much trust had been broken. But it was evolving into something different, something perhaps more honest and resilient because it had survived such a severe test. 3 years after the discovery at Raymill House, Richard was invited to a private dinner at Windsor Castle. It was a small gathering, just the king and a few trusted advisors and long-serving staff members. The king wanted to thank those who had handled the crisis with professionalism and discretion. During dinner, the king raised a toast to everyone present, acknowledging the difficult time they had all endured. He spoke about the importance of loyalty, integrity, and service. He did not mention Camilla by name, but everyone understood the subtext. They had all been tested by the scandal, and they had all emerged stronger for it. The institution had survived, the monarchy continued, and life went on. After dinner, the king asked Richard to walk with him in the gardens. They strolled through the perfectly manicured grounds as the sun set over the castle. The king thanked Richard personally for everything he had done. He acknowledged that Richard's investigation had put him in an impossible position, having to expose the crimes of the queen consort. The king said he understood that Richard had simply been doing his job, following the evidence wherever it led. He expressed gratitude for Richard's professionalism, for treating Camilla with respect even while investigating her, and for handling the entire situation with discretion. Richard accepted the thanks with humility, saying he had only done what any good officer would do. As they continued walking, the king asked Richard a question that had clearly been on his mind for some time. Did Richard think people could truly change? Could someone who had committed such a significant betrayal ever be fully trusted again? Richard thought carefully before answering. He said that in his experience, people could change, but it required genuine remorse, consistent effort, and time. A lot of time. Change was not about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about small choices made every day, about choosing the right path even when no one was watching. Whether Camilla had truly changed, only time would tell. But from what Richard had observed, she seemed to be making a genuine effort. The king nodded thoughtfully. He admitted that he wanted to believe Camilla had changed, that their marriage could survive this. But doubt lingered. Perhaps it always would. Some betrayals left permanent scars, invisible but always present. They could heal, could become less painful over time, but they never completely disappeared. Richard understood. He had seen many relationships damaged by betrayal during his career. Some survived, some did not. The determining factor was usually whether both people were willing to do the hard work of rebuilding trust. It was not easy. It was not quick. But it was possible for those who were committed to trying. Years passed. The scandal gradually faded from public consciousness, replaced by newer controversies and different headlines. Camilla continued her quiet work with charities, never seeking the spotlight but never shirking her responsibilities either. The king carried on with his duties, leading the nation through various challenges with the dignity and dedication that had defined his mother's reign. Richard continued to serve the royal family, protecting them from threats both external and internal. The three people whose lives had intersected so dramatically on that day at Raymill House had all moved forward. carrying their experiences with them but not being defined by them. The stolen jewels remained in the royal vaults, secure and protected. They had been the catalyst for everything that followed, but they were ultimately just objects, beautiful and valuable but incapable of understanding the human drama they had.